You ready?
Yeah.
All right. All right. Hi, everybody. I'm here today with Jonathan Havercroft from Southampton University. And Jonathan recently won the Brian Barry Prize for the best essay in political science. Congratulations. It's pretty cool. And that paper was on just riots. So I thought we'd talk a little bit about just riots. Jonathan's also one of the editors of a journal, and we'll talk a bit about what that's like. And he'll shill for the journal because, of course, everybody wants to and should be submitting multiple articles and multiple pieces of work for the journal on global constitutionalism. So, Jonathan, why don't you tell us a little bit about the why is there no just riot theory, and what is a just riot theory?
Oh, so thanks, Elon. Thanks for that introduction. So I've been working on that project for, God, I think four or 5 years now, and it actually grew out of my interest in international relations theory. So I was, I guess this would have been April 2015, and there'd been riots in the city of Baltimore following the police murder of Freddie Gray. In kind of a pretty brutal situation where he'd been taken into custody and given what I guess in Baltimore police parlance is what's called a rough ride. So he'd had his arms restrained behind his back, and then the police had driven the vehicle very kind of roughly around the city, and he'd kind of sustained head injuries and a possible neck injury that led to Freddie Gray's death. And so this was one of the early mass protest movements that became known as the Black Lives Matter movement in the US. And I was preparing my notes for my lecture on just war theory, and I was kind of reading the news, and I just noticed that there was kind of a gap here that international relations scholars especially, but I think also political theorists in different forms have spent a lot of time justifying all kinds of political violence. But when it comes to riots, there's a very strong resistance to thinking that a riot could ever be justified normatively, right? So by justified, I mean that, political theorists may think of justifications for revolution. In fact, there's kind of fairly strong literature looking at justifications for terrorism. There's lots of kind of literature on what justifies what's called humanitarian intervention, or what even justifies the use of nuclear weapons. So there's normative stuff about all different levels of violence. But riots, there's been very little about that in the tradition. And by the Western tradition, I mean going all the way back to, say, the ancient world. There's some people who are kind of equate to realists and IR in political theory, who kind of accept riots as a built-in feature of political life, but they don't offer normative defenses for it or think through when riots might be justified or not justified. And then, so I started doing more digging. I really noticed that post-1960s kind of American political theory, for lack of a better term. And so my targets here are Hannah Arendt, Michael Walzer, and John Rawls. All of them kind of respond to the urban riots in the US in the late 1960s and condemn them as kind of bad political action, as kind of ineffective political action. And then they all hold up Martin Luther King Jr. as the exemplar of kind of nonviolent civil disobedience, and essentially say this is the proper way forward if you have a grievance against an unjust society, such as the racially segregated US of the 1950s and 60s, and rioting is not possibly justified. What's interesting is King, there's kind of a quote that you may have heard that kind of circulated kind of post some of the riots in Ferguson and Baltimore, and more recently Minneapolis, where Martin Luther King essentially said that riots were the language of the unheard. If you go back to the speech he gives, it's actually in Detroit in 1968. It's just weeks before his assassination. And King himself's basically been called to speak about the urban unrest in the US, kind of specifically there've been riots in Detroit the summer before, also in response to police brutality. So in a certain sense, nothing's new here. And he was kind of, throughout that speech, he's absolutely refusing to condemn the riots and the rioters, and instead says what we have to do is focus on the injustices that drive the riots. So kind of looking at that history, I wanted to kind of ask, why did political theory kind of avoid riots as a topic? And the more I thought about it, it's because a riot's kind of an interesting phenomenon, and it's extra institutional. And so what I mean by that is that a riot happens outside of the normal institutions of politics. So outside of the parliamentary or legislative process, outside of kind of standard social movement mobilization. It kind of breaches the law, and I'll talk about why that is in a second. And it's actually a kind of mobilization that I call extra public, which is kind of not a great term, but as a political theorist, when you're trying to kind of point to a concept we haven't thought through, or kind of sometimes write clunky terms like that. What I simply mean by that is that we have a pretty robust way of thinking about collective action in political science and political theory, but the riots basically thought of as the mob or the crowd, and it's kind of this scary, disorganized thing that kind of acts out of control. And so political theory doesn't like that in the same way they like, well-organized social movements that can clearly articulate grievances and then kind of use the normal levers of political power to bring about change. That's kind of the standard rule of law approach, if you will. And so the riots historically have kind of been an interesting thing, that they actually, the crime of rioting in common law is actually, the victim is not any individual person. So if there was a riot and you are now present at the scene of a riot, and let's say you physically assaulted someone, you could still be charged with the direct physical assault for that person. That's like a direct case of grievous bodily harm. But if I was just there and protesting, but I didn't disperse when a dispersal order was given, then I would be guilty of the crime of riot simply for being present in a crowd that was deemed rioting by public authority. And so the more I kind of dug into this, the more I was struck by the fact that really what riot law is about is kind of maintaining crowd control, controlling protest, policing dissent. And so there certainly are cases where crowds can be kind of violent in unjust ways. So there's certainly kind of throughout history case of crowds kind of, tearing through cities and persecuting vulnerable minorities, right? We can think of, medieval pogroms against the Jewish communities in Europe, or we could think of, lynchings, or what's called the Tulsa race riot in kind of early 20th century America, or the kind of practice of lynching where kind of whites affiliated with the KKK would engage in racial persecution through riots. So there certainly are kind of horrific things that are done through riots. And there's also kind of riots like celebratory riots, like say, since you're from the west coast of Canada, quite famously after the Vancouver Canucks lost the Stanley Cup final a few years ago, there was a very big riot in Vancouver at a loss. And actually, I guess because we have a better hockey team in Montreal where I'm from, we tend to riot when the Habs win. But there's like tied to sports associations, there's rioting, and that's not justified in any certain way, shape, or form. But if other forms of political violence, or at least, we can think about them in terms of being justifiable or not, or excusable or not. So we talk a lot about warfare and have a lot of sophisticated criteria for that. What my research is trying to do is push us to think more critically about riots. So not have the knee-jerk reaction when a riot happens to kind of an obvious injustice, like a police execution of an unarmed Black man in custody by a police officer, and people are protesting both that murder, but also the longer and more systemic history of police brutality in that city or in that country. To figure out ways to think about what's excusable, what the proper ways of responding are, and perhaps develop some kind of criteria for thinking through riots that are as sophisticated as the just war criteria. We have this very long tradition in international relations theory that does that. I don't think they map on perfectly. My first attempt was to do that, and I found that it broke down pretty quickly. But I do think that there's kind of a need to think through rioting in a more sophisticated way. And so that's really what the essay is doing, and the kind of ongoing project is doing as well.
Yeah, thank you. I was fortunate enough to have read earlier versions of the paper, and I remember some of those early attempts to map the just riot and just war theory together. And I guess one of the things that I found really interesting about what you're doing is, in a way, a riot that's based on a particular, say, political grievance or something would seem to be a legitimate form of disobedience in certain circumstances. And yet, when you think about it in those ways, it's hard to it's hard to think of a theoretical tradition that provides a similar type of a similar form of normative language for how would you deal with, how do you legitimate, that form of resistance, right? You talk about revolution, there's literature on that, but somehow a riot, the idea is that, well, a riot can never be politically just. That doesn't, that just doesn't seem to make any sense. And I think you've really captured something really fascinating with that. And I was wondering, do you think there's anything about with just war, you're assuming there's a legitimate one of the tenets of just war theory is legitimate authority, and there's a particular authority that can use violence, and that's okay. It's not great, but it's okay. And with the state, when you're thinking domestically, there is only really one agency, the state, that's able to wield violence domestically. And here we're saying, well, actually, maybe that's not always the case. How do you deal, do you think that's partially why political theorists might not have dealt with the question of just riot? And how do you deal with that question of of authority? Is there any authority on behalf of these on behalf of people to riot?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I think that political theory, and this is kind of goes back to my earlier research on sovereignty, really has a lot.
Which is a great book, by the way. Great book. Everybody should read it.
Thanks for all the plugs. This is great. I should come on the show more often. So my earlier research was on sovereignty, right? The book is called Captives of Sovereignty. And part of the argument of that book is that political theories for a long time has kind of understood politics as only possible or primarily directed through a state that ends up through some kind of supreme authority called the sovereign, right? And so with war, you can actually do a story of just war theory that's not quite that. Like I basically track it back to the 1650s and kind of had an interest in how kind of post-Westphalia, the rise of the modern state has really tried to, in Weberian terms, monopolize violence. But kind of, if you look at someone like Grotius, who's writing kind of before Westphalia, the kind of moment where we're not quite sure what the new post-medieval political form is going to take. All kinds of entities can wage war, right? And specifically for him, he's kind of writing some of his early writings as a lawyer for, the Dutch East India Company and justifying their right to wage a just war against other states. So like a private company in his mind could wage war. That's not kind of legal these days, although maybe given the shape of things would be heading back in that direction. But, since kind of the 17 and 1800s, there's really been an attempt to clamp down on other forms of like non-state actors engaging in military violence. But if we kind of think a little bit more broadly, right, certainly states have used, paramilitary groups, militias, or kind of independent actors have kind of used these through terrorist groups or other kind of non-state actors have kind of done things to wage war. So you don't only necessarily have to have a state to wage war, but most of political theory and most of the just war theory tradition, kind of post-Grotius at least, has really pushed towards states being the only actors that can legitimately wage war, and then through that kind of listing out the legitimate causes of war as being things that are kind of wrongs against other states, right? Even the recent turn to kind of what we might call humanitarian war still kind of focuses on sovereignty. It's justifying invading a sovereign country on the grounds that that sovereign state has renounced its right to be a member in good standing of the international community by committing crimes against humanity, right? So it's still, just war is still waged by other states acting in concert against the state that has violated the rights of its citizens in some way, shape, or form. Riots are, I think, different than that for a bunch of reasons. They certainly can't, you can kind of think of some cases where a riot might be premeditated, so I don't want to say it's like essentially non-premeditated. But in most cases, what happens with a riot is that the crowd moves from normal protest to angry protest to somehow losing control. And it's that loss of control that's what makes a riot a riot. In fact, if you go back to riot law and riot case law, the criterion by which the state decides if a riot's a riot is whether or not a person of reasonable mind would be afraid if they were at the scene of the riot. There's actually a case that I love that I kind of dug up from like 18th century New England law, where a crowd of young men had gone drinking and hunting in the woods, and there'd been no witnesses, but they'd been loud and fired their guns off and made a big mess. And so the local authorities still charged them with the riot. And the judge had to decide the kind of very interesting question of, if a riot happens in a woods and no one's there to see it, is it still a riot? And the judge determined that yes, because the criteria is if a person of sound mind, whether they're present or not, would have thought it was a riot, then it's a riot. So it's actually this kind of uncontrolled behavior that scares the kind of anonymous figure of the public that makes it a riot. But it's normally not enacted by an organization, right? If you look at the recent riots in Minneapolis this summer in response to the death of George Floyd, it was a crowd in a community that had seen this murder, this kind of tape, this 8-minute long tape of video of George Floyd being choked to death. And then they'd assembled to protest at the police station. And the triggering thing was, I think this kind of hasn't been as well reported outside the local media of Minneapolis, but the triggering thing was when the Hennepin County attorney held a press conference and was asked whether or not they're going to charge the officers. And he said, I don't know. Like, he basically said, we've got to kind of give a typical lawyerly answer of not being certain if there was enough evidence, right? And that kind of triggered rage in the crowd, because anyone could clearly see that this police officer just stood there and murdered this guy in cold blood. There's no possible justification for choking the life out of someone for 8.5 minutes, right? And so that was spontaneous, right? That was a spontaneous act of rage. And their target, I think, interestingly enough, was under just war principles would actually be seen as quite legitimate, right? They targeted the police station. They targeted the precinct of the officer who'd committed the murder. So it was clearly retaliatory. And it was, if you're using just war criteria, you'd say it was also potentially proportionate. In fact, perhaps less so, because there was no loss of life on the police side, I don't believe. It then spills over kind of out of control, right? And so the Minneapolis really did, certain areas of Minneapolis, there's a lot of property damage, a lot of businesses were, looted and set on fire. And, it was basically three straight nights of rioting and looting before the National Guard was called in. And basically that clamped it down. But, and so a lot of the kind of liberal defense would be that this was futile. It just was like rage, a lot of damage was done, and it was pointless, right? The other reading you can give, I think, is that riot sparked the largest mass kind of protest in the US since the 60s, just by any measure. It's just like, and it wasn't just it was like this weird breaching moment, right? That I really do think that something shifted in the US consciousness about race relations that hasn't happened since the days of Martin Luther King, since the 1960s civil rights protests, I'd say. Places where I would never think of hearing talk about systemic racism we're suddenly talking about. Like, I'm a big basketball fan, and I was listening to a sports podcast, and it was like these 3 white basketball coaches. Like, you wouldn't think, one of them's kind of known as being pretty, I guess, in the parlance of our times, woke, but the other 2, you wouldn't necessarily think of them as being, social justice warrior types or that type. Having an honest conversation about race, about racial privilege, about the history of racial violence, and also kind of very reflective of their roles as kind of white men of privilege coaching, in a predominantly African-American sport, and kind of thinking through the consequences of that. So that was kind of one shock moment. And I think if you'd asked me in May, when I saw the riots in Minneapolis and the protests, I thought that would have led to a massive white backlash, as it did in 2016 in the US, and would have kind of led to a Trump re-election. But it turns out to not have. That actually, it seems like maybe not a majority of white people, unfortunately, but I think enough white people in the US got the grievances of the Black population in a certain sense for the first time. And that seemed to, in a certain sense, been a bit decisive. Maybe not the only kind of decisive factor. Obviously, COVID-19 played into this too, but in kind of Trump's kind of re-election loss. So something did come from the riots. Even just in Minneapolis, there was kind of the police officers were all charged. There's been a lot of push for kind of police reform. There's been kind of a lot of consequences happening at the kind of local level, a lot of grassroots organization, and kind of a lot of interesting direct political activities. So the riots, did actually have an effect. One of the charges the liberals like Walzer and Arendt is that the violence here, this kind of political violence, as Arendt would call it, is mute. It doesn't lead anywhere. What you need is what she calls political action. I'm a little kind of skeptical of Arendt's claim that we can make such a neat kind of divide between collective political violence and collective political action. And I think the riot's kind of one of those places where perhaps it gets a bit more complicated than Arendt and her distinctions might allow.
That's really interesting. There's so many more questions. I think before we move on to the talking about your journal, I just wanted to say how, not only is it a great paper, but also what you just spoken about and highlighting the spontaneity, the temporal element, and also the role of emotion in this. These are, I think, two aspects of our political world that I think only recently have started to gather more attention, right? How important emotion is in politics and international relations, and also the politics of time and how temporality matters also. I mean, I know your paper isn't about that, but you're just the spontaneity of it, the emotion, I think, are things that we often just probably don't think about when we're looking at political action.
Yeah, I think there's definitely been a big turn towards the politics of time in the last few years in political theory. Andrew Holmes got a very good book. Elizabeth Cohen has a very good book on these topics. I think, one of our teachers, Scott Share teachers, Rob Walker, I think was thinking about these themes in international relations quite a while ago. And there's certainly the affective turn just across the social sciences has been kind of the turn to emotion, if you will, has been significant too. I mean, some of that stuff sits in the background of my research, but I think there's a lot more there that could be done by time theorists and affect theorists about the nature of riots too.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So let's briefly, I mean, these are, we're kind of short conversations. So let's, I think at some point maybe we can revisit your paper. But you're the editor of a journal. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that and what that's like, and what's it like editing a journal, an academic journal?
So I'm an editor of Global Constitutionalism. It's about, I guess it'll be 10 years old next year. So next year's our 10th anniversary, and I've been on the editorial team since 2016. And it was set up by Jim Tully and Antje Wiener back in 2010, a little bit before that. And what it's really designed to do is be an interdisciplinary journal looking at global processes from the perspectives of political theory, international law, international relations, and history, if you will. So it's basically we talk about looking at global constitutionalism across time and across space. It's kind of one of the subtags. So that immediately kind of raises the question of what is global constitutionalism. And so one of the editors, Tony Lang, I think put it to me kind of best, right? We mean constitutionalism kind of in the Aristotelian sense of kind of what are the customs, laws, and practices of the global order, right? That if you think that there's something called global politics, there must be a set of rules, practices, norms, expectations that shape how people kind of act politically and think politically at the global level. And so there can be what I would call thick global constitutionalists who argue that there's kind of embedded in things like the United Nations Charter, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and kind of international courts, an emerging kind of set of laws and practices that are kind of thick. There could be a thinner version of that that's kind of skeptical of the power of those institutions, but perhaps is interested in kind of, how we coordinate our behavior internationally. And there could also be what I think and what I'm hoping to see a bit more in the journal is kind of a critical turn, which kind of looks at what the norms, expectations, laws, practices we've inherited as a global society are, and perhaps looking at them critically to say, how could they be better? How could they be contested to kind of bring about a different order, right? From, say, different perspectives. It's just, we've had kind of very interesting papers from feminist global constitutionalists and post-colonial constitutionalists, et cetera. So kind of critical race perspectives from the global south that have looked at kind of perhaps how global constitutional perspectives have kind of set up unjust practices in their society. So we're kind of, very open to what that term means. So that's what the journal is. So, but your question is what it's like editing a journal, or?
Yeah, tell us just briefly, what's it like editing a journal?
Okay, so the first thing I'd say is that once I started editing a journal, all my article submission paranoia went away. And so what do I mean by this? I'm not sure if you ever do this or did this, but you know, before I edit a journal, I think about the journals, I think about who the editor was, and like, is that person gonna like my article, right? And they think I would operate, and I've heard other people voice this to me, that I would try to send my article to journals that were edited by people similar perspective. And there's reasons you might want to do that, right? When you're kind of speaking to a community. But it's not the case that editing a journal is, I get to decide whether or not your piece gets published, right? As you're an editor, you're kind of stuck into a kind of process, which means that you read the article, there's a desk decision, but the desk decision is simply, is this article, you know, passing muster for, is the article passing muster in terms of what would be acceptable as an article? And then beyond that, it's simply a matter of kind of selecting reviewers and then seeing their feedback and then making a decision based on the feedback. So that's the kind of basic process. There's no kind of mystery to it or special talent to it. And nobody, it's one of those weird things where you get handed this job of kind of responsibility and nobody tells you what to do or how to do it. So there's a bit of muddling through when you begin. But I mean, it's very interesting. I think the other thing I learned pretty quickly is how little I know. Like, I mean that deeply. Like the first 10 articles I received were, sorry, is it too loud right now? Background noise? Okay.
I'm okay.
Okay, sorry. So the first thing I learned when you know, I just learned how little I knew, right? So the first 10 articles I received to review, they were just on topics that I basically knew nothing about. Like to the point I didn't even know they were topics that existed. And it turned out they were very big topics, but you know, with a quick Google, you're like, oh, wow, some very big people write on this. So you learn pretty quickly kind of how big the world of scholarship is, even if you're just confined to, you know, international relations, international law and political theory. It's still a vast ocean. So there's a lot of stuff that can fit under global constitutionalism for sure.
Great. Yeah.
What other questions do you have about journal editing?
I think for now it's probably enough.
Okay.
I mean, I know there's a lot of different elements and processes and stories and things, but maybe that's something we can revisit later. And for now, I'll just say thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, and congratulations again on the Brian Barry Prize. It's a fantastic article and very well deserved.
Oh, thanks a lot, Ian. Thanks for having me.